Keynote of today, and we're joined here by Carly Bagelman from Liverpool Hope University and Neil Winterburn from FACT in Liverpool. I'm really thrilled to introduce, I can't pretend that I am with Neil. I am quite thrilled, Neil, but I don't know you as well as I know Carly. But I'm really thrilled to introduce Carly, who's a colleague at Liverpool Hope University. And Carly is a senior lecturer at Liverpool Hope University. She researches and teaches on decolonising education and displacement and education. And she's used visual methods such as picture book making, comics, zines, and illustration in much of her research. And I know how committed she is in terms of pursuing this through our hopefully our recent curriculum developments. Carly comes from an unceded coast
Salish, you got it. Yeah.
Salish territories in British Columbia, Canada, where she formerly worked as a curriculum designer at both the Critical Thinking Consortium and at the University of Victoria. Neil, it's great to meet you and it's great to have you here. Neil works at FACT, is a learning technologist in the learning team there. Prior to that, he's worked as an artist and also as a youth worker in the UK's first digital drop-in centre for young people. He's the co-director of Redoc, an artist-led initiative, and has published articles and book chapters on artist-made kits and participatory design in the field of team-computer interaction. In this presentation, the art of welcome, supporting asylum seeker children with creative pedagogy and art, Carly and Neil will present a project designed to create a robust sense of welcome for displaced children in the UK. So it's over to you for this presentation. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you so much for having me here and having me and Neil contribute some of our thinking and work around this today. And like Claire said, my work has been, some of my work has really been around refugee and asylum seeker children and their experiences of education here in the UK. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about questions of peace as they relate to forcibly displaced peoples or refugees. And through my work with children in initial accommodation here in Liverpool, I was able to connect with the arts organization FACT, who did some wonderful projects that Neil will be speaking to. So then Neil, I'll let you just introduce yourself if you wanted to say anything at this time.
Yeah, I suppose just quickly, I work as part of a team. There's myself and three other women that make up the FACT learning team. So Lucia Arias is our manager, who brings the vision and methodology, and interesting quotes that I'll share later. And I also work with Ash Sands and Rachel Mason, who work as a learning facilitator and producer.
Yeah, so some of the projects that you're presenting today, Neil, as part of this will be are reflective of some of that collaborative work that you've done. So today we're going to be looking at some of these key topics. I'm interested in sort of firstly tracing some challenges in resettlement education for displaced peoples, and I'll ground that discussion a little bit in some philosophical theory about displacement and talk about how refugees could be described as living in a state of exception. And then I want to talk about some local responses to these challenges, in particular Liverpool's arrival school. Then Neil's going to come in and share some examples from practice. So FACT led a number of projects at this arrival school, which involve, as he'll unpack, digital mapping, self-sculpting, some gallery tours, and some other activities. All right, so when we talk about creating welcome for displaced peoples, often we're talking about a resettlement process, and that sort of embodies the types of services and supports that are in place to enable a displaced person to live in their new context. So I'm going to share a definition that the UNHCR uses to describe resettlement. And I want to just highlight a couple of key concepts here really it's supposed to be an international protection to meet specific needs of individual refugees whose lives and rights are at stake, really. Secondly, it's supposed to be a durable solution for larger groups of refugees. And then thirdly, it can be a tangible expression of international solidarity and a responsibility sharing mechanism. So in a sense, I think this kind of describes maybe the sort of institutional and official conception of resettlement. I think for the purposes of our work, the work that we're going to be sharing today, I think it's kind of an insufficient definition. In particular, because I think that resettlement should actually be understood as a robust humanitarian and political project, not just a set of infrastructures. So where people flee conflict and instability, as refugees do, resettlement should really mean creating the necessary conditions for peace. And this needs to go beyond what's typically provided that we see here in this description. So I'm just going to sort of provide a little bit of a sketch of some of the resettlement education challenges that face the UK and other contexts as well. So upon arrival, a displaced person starts to live in initial accommodation, and these are hostels or converted hotels. And sorry, the reason why I think it's important to think about resettlement education is because education is a key access point for resettlement services and supports for children and often for families. So it's really a good place to look when we're considering whether or not resettlement is creating the conditions for peace, as I've suggested would be its goal. So when families and children arrive into initial accommodation, the Home Office has suggested that they're really only meant to be there for about 3 or 4 weeks. But in practice, this target is almost never met. So in my experience working with people in initial accommodation, people are there for months on end, and during COVID, over a year. And during this period, importantly, there's often no access to schools. So this obviously is a violation of the Education Act in England and Wales, which suggests that everyone has a right to access education, and it also contradicts international agreements like the Human Rights Act and the UNCRC, the Convention on the Rights of a Child. When asylum seekers are then given their state housing, when they're so-called dispersed to their new houses, children then enter mainstream schools and they face a new set of barriers. You can see on the slide that I've included just a few of these, one being that there's no pupil premium or free school meals for these children, despite them being some of the most food insecure in the country. There's really no mandatory or quality controlled approach to welcoming these displaced peoples. So the Department for Education hasn't really developed any kind of induction practice or curriculum that might support these young people. And often we see quite low attainment rates for displaced peoples, which Jill Rutter describes as not a result of their performance or ability, but really compound factors such as teachers having a lack of teacher training and awareness of cultural relevant pedagogies and putting students instinctively into lower sets. So in some senses, we can kind of consider this not an attainment gap, but more of a provision gap. So when I mention initial accommodation, I'm going to provide these 3 images. They really illustrate what resettlement looks like and really highlights some of the failures of resettlement to create the conditions for peace. On the bottom left-hand side, there's an image of some housing, and you may or may not recognize that this is Dachau, which was the longest operating concentration camp in Germany And in 2015, this concentration camp, this site was used to house displaced peoples. To its right, you'll see a brick building, and this is in a more local, close to home example in Widnes. This was initially a care facility for elderly people, and it was designed and to house about 60 people in care. This was shut down actually because it wasn't meeting the standards for safety, but then the Home Office and Serco, who deals with housing, suggested reopening the hostel to house 120 displaced peoples. And this resulted in fairly large protests of local people who could be described as sort of NIMBYs, this not my backyard, this kind of desire to not welcome people into their community. And then lastly, at the top, we have some children playing outside of the notorious Red Road flats in Glasgow. So these Glasgows have now been demolished, but they had really serious maintenance issues, including faulty elevators, heating problems, dampness, poor insulation, pests, and poor security. So here's the last image I'm going to share of an initial accommodation. And this photo was taken in Rotherham in the UK this summer. This initial accommodation was being attacked during the riots this summer that followed the stabbings in Southport. And really, this image kind of demonstrates the limits of, John was discussing this morning, the limits of sort of the idea of a negative peace, this idea that the absence of war does not produce peace, as you can see here in this image. And in the examples before, the absence of war did not produce peace in these contexts. In many ways, they produced, there's still a production of insecurity in the way that we receive and resettle new arrivals. So how can this happen? This is a big question. How can there be refuge in the form of housing, but an absence of rights within its walls? And how can there be a provision of shelter and also the denial of a human right like education? Well, one of the philosophical explanations for this, it comes from Giorgio Agamben, and he suggests that refugees are neither included in the legal order nor are they fully excluded. They're actually suspended in a zone of indistinction or a state of exception. And Agamben emphasizes that this is because substantive social and political rights can only be understood through the state and citizenship. And this actually becomes really clear when we take notice that the figure of the refugee is always seen as a temporary category to either be naturalized or repatriated. You can see we're revisiting this UNHCR definition of resettlement here, and I've highlighted this passage. Durable solutions of voluntary repatriation, which means going back to their homes of origin, or local integration, right? So they need to be subsumed by the state in order to be rights-bearing individuals. So considering this, since refugees lack citizenship, they're offered what Giorgio Agamben calls a bare life. They're denied the protections given to members of a political community. Bare life is defined as a life reduced to its most basic biological existence, stripped of political identity and agency and legal protections. And we can see what this means in real terms when we look at the examples of refugee education, resettlement education, and accommodation that I've just explored. For Agamben, refugees expose the limitations of a system in which rights are conditional on legal status rather than being conditional on just simply being human. So in other words, displaced peoples can teach us about the barriers to bringing meaningful peace under the current order. But, and perhaps this is hopeful, according to Agamben and other theorists like Hannah Arendt, spaces of exception that displaced peoples live within can become sites of transformation. In spaces outside of normal control, new forms of community and belonging can emerge, and they can challenge the structures that are responsible for that exclusion in the first place. By addressing the plights of refugees, we might reimagine political belonging based on shared humanity rather than the conditional membership of, for example, citizenship. And now I'm going to just turn to a really local, for us, example of a space of transformation. And this is a space that was set up by Liverpool City Council. And we have informally referred to this as a rival school. So it's an educational space. On the slide, I've included an image of the Mansion House, which is in the Calderstones Park near our campus, actually. And the students meet in one of the rooms within this building, and they have very similar schedule to a standard school. 5 days a week, they meet with qualified teachers, but unlike a sort of standard mainstream school, in these classes, they're mixed ages, mixed English abilities, and very mixed experiences of schooling. Some children have not actually been in formal schooling due to living in conflict zones and other instability. So what we also notice in these spaces, in the space of the arrival school, is that there's often the use of really creative pedagogies. And in the second half of this talk, Neil is going to be talking about the practical and artistic ways of supporting resettlement for students who attend this arrival school. And before I hand it over to Neil, I wanted to share some of the learnings from arrival school in terms of the pedagogy and practice. And I think this is reflected also in the work that Neil and his colleagues carried out with the students through the various art projects. So firstly, one thing that was really effective in this space was that the teachers really were dedicated to having an awareness of forced migration and resettlement. They focused on displaced people's accounts of what that means. They really explored the policies that affect their region. And they invested time in understanding what culturally relevant practices would look like in terms of teaching and providing care. Another aspect of sort of best practice within the arrival school that I observed in my work there was this kind of dedication to revealing and reworking the hidden curriculum. So really with the students, the teachers spent kind of really made explicit the kind of social codes, routines, and approaches that are used within mainstream educational spaces in the UK. And this was sort of a practice space, if you want, in the arrival school, because it wasn't a mainstream space. It was a sort of a limbo space where students could learn about some of those social codes and test them out and also critique them. And in some senses, when they do get dispersed and sent to a mainstream school, the feeling is that this will probably reduce their sort of acculturation stress when they arrive there. So, just the importance of understanding how schools operate. This is a foundational knowledge that allow the students to then build the curricular knowledge in the future, because oftentimes there's a temptation to really just get the student quickly to catch up with the learning outcomes and to ensure that they're fluent English speakers and these kinds of learning objectives with a neglect of the kind of social codes that would allow them to succeed within that space in the first place. So some other learnings from some lessons from the arrival school were that the teachers were really effective at using sort of funds of knowledge approaches. So moving away from thinking about displaced peoples as having a deficit, they have a lack of English knowledge or speaking skills, and maybe they have a lack of good mental health outcomes. this is the way that displaced peoples are often seen in kind of this deficit frame. And so what we noticed in this educational space of the arrival school is that there was really a move towards celebrating the knowledge that these displaced peoples held, and supporting hybrid identity formation, as opposed to which really brings in the former knowledge that they had from their previous contexts, and really blending that with the new forms of knowledge that they're developing in their new home contexts here in the UK or wherever it is that they land. And lastly, which this really provides a bridge into some of the work that Neil and his colleagues did, was that the other really effective thing in practice with refugees in educational spaces to provide really robust resettlement is that you have to work with other organizations and third sector organizations, because the teacher experiences often a really immense sense of pressure that they need to provide the welcome entirely on their own. And so kind of casting the net out alleviates the pressures on education. It means that there's a sharing of resources, or what I have referred to as building bridges between different forms of care, which is really essential to providing, the new arrival or the displaced person a kind of a more robust sense of welcome. Okay, so maybe I'll just hand it over to you, Neil, to describe some of the work that you did in the arrival school.
Thanks, Kelly. That was so interesting just to hear, especially all the context you were giving and framework, but especially the how you were talking about the space for possibilities in people and groups of people being identified in a state of exception. That it really felt working in the school. It really felt like here's a community that's in where there's just so much possibility. There's such a sort of space for creativity from the young people there for them to define who they might be in that very limited space. Okay, I've taken my headphones off because the noise cancelling is so good I can't hear myself. So please, if something needs to be said, can someone raise their hand or something, please? Thank you. So yeah, I work in the learning team at FACT, and we've been doing some work at the arrival school over the past few years. Those of you that don't know FACT, we're an art gallery and a cinema in city centre Liverpool. And we work with artists who are interested in how technology impacts everyday life. And as a team, we're educators, translators, not in a different languages sense, symbolically, I suppose, and art producers as required. FACT's been open for 20 years. And in 1999, FACT commissioned art collective Superflex to produce Tenant Spin, which was an internet TV project set in a high-rise block of flats, a sheltered accommodation space in Liverpool. And since that project, really, FACT's engagement program or learning team has been testing different ways to situate people's experience with technology at the centre of our artistic program. So in this current learning team, the reason we do this work really is we don't think there's enough spaces where young people are listened to by adults, particularly around matters of technology in society. So we're interested in the superpower of visual art institutions to create these incredible spaces, these gallery spaces that adults go to open themselves up to different ways of experiencing, different ways of knowing, different ways of seeing. And we're interested in how they could be spaces that young people are seen and heard more. I'm going to talk about 3 activities we did with young people and staff at the arrival school. But first of all, I'd like to talk just a little bit about our practice and what we do. Oh, actually, before that, an advert. We've got an exhibition opening tonight called Cosmotechnics. It's featuring artists Attractor Studio, Semantica, Patricia Dominguez, Rebecca Romero, and they're all showing work that challenges the idea that technology is the same everywhere across different cultures. We just saw it this afternoon. It's really worth a look. If anyone's in town, especially over the next day or so or this weekend, I recommend having a look. It draws inspiration from plant life to reimagine technology um, as something that's ever changing. Um, okay, so the learning program at FACT. Sorry, can we go back to the previous one? Sorry. Thank you. We invite artists to work with participants, and together they produce different ways to engage in contemporary issues with technology. One of our main strands of work is with young people aged between 11 and 17 years old. As we were saying, we think this is a group that's often excluded from conversations around society and technology. We've got another strand, which is work within the justice system, which is often working with groups of people who feel very excluded from conversations around which there are huge political agendas. And our third and most recent strand is to be working with young people and staff at the Clatterbridge Cancer Centre in Liverpool. There we're working with artist Nina Davis to produce artwork to be shown both at FACT and in the hospital. I was talking earlier about Lucia, who's the doing her PhD at the minute, and is the person who brings the vision and the methodology to our work. And she shared this quote by I'm probably saying this wrong, but Helguera, um, who writes brilliant stuff around socially engaged art. And he says social work is a values-based profession based on a tradition of beliefs based on tradition of beliefs that stems from the aim of the betterment of humanity and supports ideas of social justice. An artist, by contrast, may subscribe to the same values, but make work that ionizes, problematizes, and even enhances tensions around those subjects in order to provoke reflection. And we find that inspiring all the time. And it's one of the main reasons that the learning program at FACT is part of the artistic program. It's bang in the middle of that. And we understand pedagogy and art production as being two parts of the same practice. Um, as a space where artists and participants and young people especially can work together to produce new forms of knowledge that then can be shared with audiences. And we're interested in what's unique about artists' expertise to create aesthetic experiences for people to encounter this new knowledge. Can we go new slide, please? So in the past 6 years, we've been testing a learning program that focuses on art commissions. And we do that by creating opportunities for learning that are project-based, led by work with the artists, and by producing new artworks made with participants. So most of our projects have artistic outcomes shared with audiences, not all. And this is we love a map and a chart. This is one of the charts that we've made talking about the learning program. So we understand participants to be experts. And a lot of time we engage young people as experts in their own experience, particularly of online cultures and their experience of technology. And we ask the artists to lead on conveying the different strands of this knowledge that they create together. And we see our role as being to advocate for the interests of the participants within the institution, to articulate the ethical framework and tensions within that. And help the artist make space for dialogue with young people, and then also to help the artist produce the artwork. Could we go next slide, please? So this is another diagram around what we call our duty of care. So we have this thing we call our duty of care, which is a very expanded understanding of safeguarding within our practice. Because we want to produce both the best artwork, but also the best learning experience for participants. And we don't want to compromise on either, but it leads us into a constant state of tension between those different drivers that pull on everyone involved in the process. But we tend to work a lot with our peers around curating artists and how the artwork might be presented. But then when working with educators and ourselves as educators, spending a lot of time thinking about safeguarding and pedagogical frameworks. As I was saying, most of our projects lead to artistic outcomes. But we also have aspects of our work where we take learning from artistic productions that have involved young people and artists, and we take that to other spaces like schools, youth clubs, and the Arrival School as an example of that. Uh, could we go next slide, please? So here's an example of one of our galleries being transformed by an artwork created by the artist Danielle Brathwaite Shirley, working with a group of 10 young people from across Liverpool, a group of teenagers. Um, they spent a year together um, inventing and reimagining Liverpool, and what gallery visitors would experience as they came into Gallery 1 here, would be something that feels like walking into a street scene of some kind of fantasy version of Liverpool in which teenagers have taken over. Um, and adults would walk into the space and maybe look a bit lost. Um, but uh, they'd encountered this world that's been imagined by these young people and play computer games that are embedded in the different sets that are there. One of the young people talked about it as it's a group project where we all make a kind of a game type thing that represents all of us individually, all of us as a group, and what we take from Liverpool and put into the game. And that's basically about the group. Remember, have fun, enjoy the experience. So the young people spent a lot of time, as I'll show in a second, world building, inventing alternate worlds of Liverpool. Um, and the project built on our experience working with youth organisations across the city, and young people based on their knowledge of online culture. Um, the worlds they shared with Danielle didn't join up neatly. And Danielle, as an artist, resisted the pressure to tie them up into one neat, simple story that'd be easy to understand. It was a complicated space for people to walk into. And she talked about channeling the young people's ideas rather than translating all storytelling. Can we go 2 slides ahead, please? Actually, we could skip the next one, please. So you can see here a map on the left. This is one of the things the young people used to invent the exhibition. We asked the young people, how would they redesign Liverpool for their community? What does their world need, and what rules does your world have? And then we asked them all to draw fantasy versions of their area. I could talk all day about it because they were so imaginative, but I'm going to leave it. Um, this was a project that we spent 6 months recruiting. We paid the young people for the participation in, and worked very in depth with uh, particularly three youth projects, to make sure the young people were supported throughout. Um, and you can see here on the right, you can see Danielle visiting the Unity Youth Club in Toxteth, talking to young people about the project. So this is probably the project that we brought the most learning from into the work we were doing with the Arrival School. But it's also a good example of the work we try and do. Could we go to the next slide, please, Kelly? None of us are specialised in working with refugees and asylum seekers or refugee and asylum seeker young people. We're not art therapists. The work that we do doesn't have therapeutic aims either, in particular. We're interested in art as a space for learning and the possibilities within that. But I just wanted to mention quickly something that did inform some of the work we did with Arrival School, which is learning we've been doing with Zebra Collective around trauma-informed practice. We've spent the past 2 years working quite closely with Zebra Collective to help us evaluate projects, particularly in the justice system, and we've been doing some really interesting training with them. I feel like I'm just dipping my toe into an understanding of trauma-informed practice, but I think it's probably fair to say a few years ago, if I'd have been doing these workshops with young people at the Arrival School, I might have felt a responsibility to design activities that would very much focus in on the young people's migration experience, their country of origin, and that might encourage young people to bring some of, as Gabor Mate talks about, the kind of big T trauma that they may have experienced. And I think since this work we've been doing, thinking around trauma-informed practice, We design activities quite differently, really, for if we're working with a group who we think there's a good chance that might have experienced some serious trauma in their past. Um, so we for these activities, we asked the young people to tell us about and be creative about their lives now. So we designed out activities that would create a space for them to share their expertise in their experiences, particularly of online cultures. And we're interested in that being a space for the teachers to listen and learn from them. And to sort of rebalance some of that deficit thinking that Callie was talking about. Um, and we also wanted them to experience FACT and feel welcome in FACT, which I'll talk about soon. But I suppose Bill O'Hanlon's got a really lovely quote where he talks about being 1 foot in acknowledgement, 1 foot in possibility with people. And we're interested in how art can kind of become a space and a framework for supporting people to explore possibilities as they see them. Could we go to the next slide, please, Callum? So this beautiful map is a map of what the young people at Arrival School like to do online. So we've spent a good few years now working with young people, asking them to create digital maps of their online lives. So when we first went to Arrival School, it felt like a good time to do that. It's something we'd explored with the group with Danielle a lot too. Um, so this was our first activity, and we asked the young people, what do you like to do on the internet? We gave them some prompts of TV and film, food, games, and music. And we introduced them to a piece of software called Miro, which is a zoomable, scrollable 2D online space in which you can position and move and delete images, video, and text. And kind of the really fun thing about it is it's a collaborative space as well. So we had 12 laptops open, all running at the same time, all editing the same space. Adults tend to use this for creating mood boards and chats and presentations. We use it a lot ourselves, but nowhere near as interesting a way as the young people do. And it just gets really interesting when the young people realize that they can move what each other are doing. And it just becomes a just such an interesting, playful, contested space for the young people to represent their knowledge in. We only have one rule, which is don't delete something someone else has put into the space. Um, and I suppose as well, just to show what we're seeing here is images, but in the actual session, this was very much a living thing. It's a very joyful thing to watch. Um, just this map kind of moving and morphing as young people are moving each other's things. I think as soon as they realize they can move their friend's picture, or bring their favorite K-pop artist massively up front and center, there's just a huge excitement in the room. Um, so could we go? Yeah, next picture, please. Um,
Sorry, Neil, we've got about 2 minutes.
oh, sorry. Okay. So we thought this was interesting as a space for them to talk about their hybrid identities. Um, it's it's as Callie was talking about. We felt like we didn't want to ask them just about their identities as migrants, and we didn't want to just be asking them to be ambassadors for their culture and their country origin. Um, and we didn't want to be asking them to perform their culture, so we asked them to talk about things they enjoy and to show us things that brought them pleasure and enjoyment. Um, and however playful it was, there's a really interesting sense of struggle over what this space might be. Um, I think, all right, I'm going to skip that because I think Callie might talk about that. But we loved seeing their maps and the excitement in the room. And we enjoyed the fact that it gave them a sense, opportunity to show us their collective knowledge. And as much as the UK education system can often just try and channel people into just having very individualized knowledge, and only take an interest in that, we enjoyed this was very much collective knowledge writ large, in the space. And also I particularly enjoyed when they bring on references that I've got no clue about, because it just feels like a visual representation of things that they know about, but I don't. And it felt like it did a very interesting thing to reposition um, the relationships in the room, and it encourages us to sit in a space of not knowing in relationship to the young people, which felt really interesting because we just had so many rich conversations after that. Really quickly, could we just do a couple of slides on to the 3D sculpture, 3D model thing? Here we go. That might need a click to play. Maybe, Callie? Is it not playing? Oh, it might just be loading. The other activity that's worth talking about is we asked the young people to sculpt Play-Doh computer game avatars, and then we then helped them digitally scan themselves. Um, and it looks like that's not one. They made really beautiful 3D characters of themselves. And I'm out of time there, so I'm going to hand back over to Callie. Sorry for running over, Callie.
Not to worry. Yes, there's so many. So also one thing that they did was also invite the participants from the arrival school into the gallery. Oops, sorry. I'm just going to provide one conclusion slide here, if the slide deck will allow it. Okay. All right. So the lives of displaced peoples who sort of exist in this state of exception, as I've suggested sort of at the top of this presentation, sort of exposes the limits of our current rights frameworks and emphasizes the need to rethink how we understand citizenship and belonging, not just for displaced people, but for all of us. Oftentimes, institutional responses to resettlement fail to offer anything more than bare life, or what Agamben refers to as Zoe, in borrowing from Aristotelian terms. You know, he calls for rethinking citizenship and belonging. There's a need for a shift from current responses to displacement to more radical political change that questions national boundaries and exclusionary practices of states that produce the refugees in the first place. And so while I think these projects don't achieve these radical ends, they are, we think, reflective of a space of transformation towards a more meaningful resettlement, which starts to create pathways for peace and supports the bios, or that is, not just bare life, but the aspects of life that give us meaning. And hopefully some of the examples that Neil has brought to the table kind of animates that idea. So thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you, Neil. That was amazing. I can't believe that I learned so much about work that's going on just down the road that I didn't know about. So it's amazing to see and to hear more about those projects. And hopefully maybe we'll have more time to explore some of that work. I know Carly, for example, is joining us tomorrow in the panel. I'm just going to check in if we did have any comments or questions in chat. And I can't see anything there at the moment. But as I've mentioned, we're moving into a transition point now where we're going to pick up with John Johnston again without a break. So there's an opportunity to pick up the threads, and obviously the very not just threads, the very deep connections between aspects that John introduced first thing, and that's moved through the day. So I'm just going to pause and see if we've got some really lovely feedback in the comments. We can collate those for you as well. Okay, can we just thank everybody in whatever way we do that on Zoom, but can we just thank Carly and Neil for that really insightful presentation.